some that are like 8 feet tall, that they get the morning sun,
Yep.
shaded with oak, so it has, up near Blanco.
Amazing. I'd cut it back to probably a foot. Otherwise, it's going to be 12 feet tall and it's going to break.
Yeah, it's too big.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
This way not to have a leggy faced one.
I'm going to tell you about that in just a minute.
Amaryllis that didn't die back.
The thing that makes amaryllis die back is more drought than cold. Stop watering, let them die back. Force them into dormancy. Part of the world they come from, it's a dry season makes them dormant, not cold weather. Stop watering.
So
let
don't
them
trim it or anything.
No, if you can avoid it, yes.
They cut the melons now.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
I've got-
Burford holly, you want berries. So we're going to prune them while they're in bloom, which is going to be in about a month. And that way we can leave the limbs that have the most flowers and take away the limbs that are short of flowers.
They are huge and red berries at Christmas time, so they've done the berry thing.
Okay,
The
but,
flowers and the berries.
okay, that's a good question. Hollies, she's saying the berries are all done. Well, the blooms that are going to make next year's berries, those little buds have already formed. And if we go through and just prune them randomly, we're cutting off the buds. So no buds, no flowers, no berries next year.
So I'd have to sacrifice a year. of berries to
No,
get
not
the
necessarily.
shape.
What you want to do is wait until they are in flower. And then, any way you possibly can, leave limbs that have lots of flowers on them and totally remove limbs that don't have very many flowers. That way you'll get the best of both worlds. You can reduce the size, but you can save enough blooms to have some good berries next year too. But the other part is overgrown plants. We'll get to that in just a second. Yes?
One Pride of Barbados.
Pride of Barbados is going to freeze to the ground most years. Cut it down to about 6 inches high.
What if it hasn't frozen?
Cut it down to about 6 inches high. Unless you want it to be as tall as this.
And I have one that's kind of bushy, the first 2 or 3 feet, and
Uh-huh.
then you have to put snags at the next 6 or 7 feet is just the stem.
Yeah.
You cut that way down.
You'll cut that way back. Yes.
Plumbago.
Plumbago, depends on how big you want it. If it didn't freeze and it's this tall and you want it this tall, we had a plumbago growing up in one of those hollies for a while and it was this tall and blooming, way up in the top. Pretty stupid looking for a plumbago. I cut it down to about 6 to 10 inches high if you want it down close to the ground. Yes.
Now back to the amaryllis. Mine blooms at Easter. So am I supposed to? just
Right
let-
now, let it. I mean, you want to feed it, you want to water it, you want to create as much growth as you possibly can because that bulb is rebuilding itself. Is it in foliage now?
Yeah, I mean
Okay.
it never dies. It's
Okay.
just always.
Well,
green.
if you want it in bloom, you're not going to have it in bloom by Easter this year. If you wanted it in bloom on Easter, you should have stopped watering it like the 1st of November so that it would then go dormant. You'd leave it dormant for 6 weeks until the middle of January. Then you'd start watering it, it'd come up and bloom
It
sometime in
used to
Easter.
bloom at Christmas. Now we're at Easter.
It's going to bloom. It's going to bloom about 2.5 months after you make it go dormant. So you can look at the calendar, go back 2.5 months. That's when you should stop watering it and force it to go dormant.
I'm never stopping.
Yeah, you never stop growing, so it's never going to bloom again until you make it go dormant. Yes.
Question again about pepper.
Uh-huh.
When I drive around the neighborhood and almost all of them are top.
Terrible
That's
practice.
Not to do.
We call that crepe murder.
How do you then prune?
I'm going to come to that in just a second. Any more questions about specific plants and when to prune them? Yes. Gerantas?
I have one that's about 10 feet tall.
If you want it smaller, prune it. If you want it big, don't prune it. That's a tropical. Yeah. It's up to you. Yes.
I have a Texas sage bush
Uh-huh.
that when I bought the house, it's real green on the bottom, but real twiggy.
I'm going to come to that in a minute. Are there any other specific plants that you want to know when to flower? Yes. It's best not to. You'll lose a lot of fruit if you do. Yes. Prune them right now because you're growing for the leaves, not the flowers.
Flowers, let's get rid of them.
Yeah. They're not.
I've heard you sound your show, ain't it time to prune lambs, cut them all the way back?
Any perennials that are frozen back, go ahead and cut them all the way back.
To the ground. I mean, just
Hydrangeas? If you have to prune them at all, you can prune them now. But normally don't prune them, but if you want to make them smaller, prune them now. Yes.
We have 2 esperanzas in our garden and we have to walk through the sidewalk and they're just going like crazy. I think you said earlier, cut them back a little bit, then wait till they bloom and then cut
Wait till
them
they
back.
start coming out, then cut them back to that point. Then look at them, and if they're growing the wrong direction, cut those things all the way off. Make a little tunnel. Okay, we'll have time for more questions later, but I want to talk about shrubs now. And the time that you prune something like this plant. I'm going to put it up here where you can see it. A young plant, it's very important that you prune it early in its life to make it branch out down low. That's hard to do because you're sacrificing size. You want that hedge to be 12 feet tall, and the last thing on earth you want to do is cut 2 feet of the growth off of it. If you don't prune shrubs when they are young, they will develop very bare at the base, and eventually you'll have all this foliage up on top and nothing but bare stems down below. If you want a good example of a good grower versus a lower quality grower that's only looking at price only, this plant is grown by a company named Greenleaf Nursery that we buy most of our shrubs from. Go down to Home Depot when you leave here and look at some of the plants that are grown by Color Spot down there. They're going to be a lot taller, and they're going to have very little branching down low. See how low branched this is? That plant was cut off when it was 3 inches tall. And see how it branched out? This one produced 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different stems coming out. And then it was cut off again here and several other places to make it branch again. So what did you get? Instead of one long stem coming up, you cut it off here and you got 4 stems coming out. You cut each one of those off, and everywhere you cut that off, you got 3 or 4 or 5 new stems coming out. This plant is going to, when you put this in the ground, this foliage is going to virtually touch the ground. And if that's the way you want a plant to grow, when you plant a young viburnum, a young pittosporum, a young boxwood, something like that, you want to prune it its first year. You want to prune it fairly low to make it branch out. Because otherwise, like I say, several years down the road, it's going to be totally bare at the bottom. And if you do it right, you can have foliage from the ground all the way up. Now that's not always the way you want it. Maybe you want a tree-form crepe myrtle. You do just the reverse. You go through, you let it grow tall, and you trim out all except the 3 or 4 tall trunks you want. And you keep cutting off all the little low growth because you want that thing to make a tree and get up tall. But most shrubs that you want low and dense, your early pruning is very, very important. And so young things, we're going to prune them back to make them branch really heavily, following the same principles we talked about where we cut prune, how the buds, branch and begin to come out. Mature plants, they're at the size that you would like them to stay. Your boxwood is this tall, and you want it to stay exactly that height. Well, then you pruned it exactly the right spot last year, so you go and you follow down the stem and you say, okay, I cut it here and it grew back here. That's perfect. That's about how much you should prune it back again this year. Well, it's this tall and you didn't want it this tall, so you look where you pruned it last year, cut it down below that point. Maybe it's this tall and you wanted it this tall, you cut it back too far last year. When you're on a regular yearly schedule of pruning, you can look at where your pruning was done last year, and that's going to tell you everything you need to know about how far you should cut it back this year. Does that make sense? Now, there are a couple of exceptions. Things that don't branch, like nandinas, that's a special case. We'll talk about nandinas, and we'll talk about crepe myrtles in just a minute. But mature shrubs that are the proper size, pruning is really easy. Just go through this time of year and cut off about the same amount that you cut off last year. If they grew back too big, you didn't prune them far enough. If they didn't grow back enough, well, you cut them too far back. And the plant will talk to you. It'll tell you how much growth it's going to put on in an average year, and that's going to give you all the hints that you need about how much to prune it.
What's
That's what I'm coming to next. I'll cover that next.
Just gonna ask you about the pittosporum. If it's a miniature pittosporum, do you still?
You probably don't need to prune it at all, except that first year or so to make it branch. Now the question is about a spindly, overgrown plant. And I'm sure this is